Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City or Verona, New Jersey, or Brescia if there's a Brescia in North America, or good evening if you are in London, England, or Brescia, Italy, or Lake Garda or Verona in northern Italy. My guest is from all of these places, apparently. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is Emil Vincenzi, a baritone, who joins us from London, but is originally from a very particular part of northern Italy that I'd like to talk to him about it first. But first, Emil Vincenzi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, in doing my research about you, I'm not sure if you are from Brescia, from Verona, from somewhere in between.
I was born in Verona. I'm a Verona guy. Born in the
Okay.
city. I did study at the Brescia Conservatory for a few years, and that's where I graduated in 2003, the first time. So maybe you found some
I did. I mean, I
information about
actually,
that.
because one of my dearest friends, I don't see him very often, was born in Brescia and lives in Verona. And it happens that that particular little zone of northern Italy, all of northern Italy, all of Italy is wonderful, but that zone includes Brescia, which is historically a rather industrial city, but it's also the
Mm.
city that made the weaponry for much of Europe. It's the
Mm.
arms capital of Italy. And Brescia has, and I mean this in the best way, a very particular style. The architecture is unusual. It's a combination of early Lombard plus fascist architecture. The people tend to be very elegant. The bakeries are terrific. Um, the food in general in Brescia is very good. It is, I believe, the second largest city in Lombardy after Milan itself. It has a great musical tradition. Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli, the great pianist, was from there. There are wonderful festivals there. One of my favorite opera houses in Italy is the Teatro Grande, which is a gorgeous theater. And in any other major city in the world, it would be the center of attention for everyone. Um, and in Brescia, it's the local theater, but it's such a beautiful theater, and people who go to the opera in Brescia really get dressed up. It's a very particular, elegant city, but one that does not try to announce itself to the world. Whereas nearby Verona is an incredibly famous city and justifiably famous. It's the Veneto. So it's sort of the border between Lombardy and Veneto. In between is Lake Garda. And there's a town called Sirmione and another town called Desenzano that's right between Verona and Brescia. And I don't know if you know this, but more opera singers live in that little community between Brescia, Desenzano, Sirmione, and Verona than any other part of Italy because
I didn't
they're
know that.
able to get to all the places they need to work, but the quality of life is so good where you're from. Um, the food is delicious in Verona, even though it's just nearby. It's very different food from Brescia. It's remarkably different food. And there's a little town whose name I'm forgetting right now. It's in the province, I believe, of Verona, that is famous for its tortellini. You know the town I mean?
Valeggio sul Mincio.
Vallejo sul Mincio, the Mincio River being the river that flows down to Mantova and is where Gilda, where Rigoletto and Sparafugile and Gilda end up at the end of the opera Rigoletto. So that little
Exactly.
zone right there, and Verdi was nearby province of Parma, Cremona. That
Mm.
zone right there where the violins are from is, I think, inch for inch, meter for meter, maybe the most deeply operatic territory in Italy. That's saying a lot, I know, because there's Milan and Florence and Rome and Venice and Naples and all these places. but even the little towns, I wish I had thought of this ahead of time. There's a bakery in the province of Brescia. The town starts with a D, like Deseo, something like that. And they're very famous for their panettone. It's 135 years old. And the grandfather was a collector of opera costumes. So when you go to that bakery, and if you're nice and you go in the back, they have opera costumes from the Arena di Verona from about 1940, which is remarkable. And wherever you go in this part of Italy, there's a deep passion for opera. So that leads me to my first question, Emil. Where did your passion for opera begin?
Oh, well, it began in Verona, and I guess I found my passion for opera when I was about 17, 18. I really didn't have any passion for opera before. I had a big passion for instrumental music, symphonic music. That's what we grew up listening to in my family. And I remember as a child being taken to the arena, as you can imagine, in the summer, try to attend a few of the shows, and never really got that interest out of me.
So, because not everybody listening has been to Verona, would you describe the Arena di Verona as a place where it is
Oh,
in
yeah.
on Piazza Broad, right in the middle of the city,
Yeah,
and
so
its
what now
cultural
is the
role?
city center?
Yeah.
It was at the time when the Romans built this big, large amphitheater. It was right outside the Roman walls, and then in the century became the new center of town as the city expanded and surrounded it. So it's right on the main square where the town hall is. You can imagine, you can picture it as a Colosseum, smaller, because it's not as large as the one in Rome, but is better preserved, I would say. You still have all the stone steps inside, so it's been used in the centuries from for different reasons. And since 19 was it how 1911
20s, like maybe earlier, 1911. Okay.
or 1913?
Yeah,
Oh my
around
God.
then.
I was one
Mhm.
of the anniversaries, right? Either the anniversary of Giuseppe Verdi's birth or
So
death.
Verdi was born October 10th, 1813. So it would be
Yeah, so probably
1913.
1913 for the 100th anniversary of his
Right.
birth,
And they
I
did
guess.
Aida.
They did an Aida and they started using the amphitheater over the summer for this. And they started what is now the festival of the
Mhm.
Arena di Verona, which is a summer opera festival where you attend opera inside the Roman amphitheater in the open air. Um, and so it's a main attraction in town, we could say. So attending the opera in the summer is one of the main reasons why someone will go visit Verona still today. And I was brought, just like any, I guess most children in Verona, you're taken there to experience what the city is famous for. And so I was brought there as a child. I remember, I think it was an Aida, my very first show, and I could not, I could not stay awake up until the end of the second act. And I have this memory of asking my mum why they were announcing a cast change of Aida after the second act. And she answered that the opera was way too long for anyone to learn the whole thing. And so I have this memory of imagining operas being way too long for anyone to sustain, singers and audience. So I would fall asleep and then we would just go home. But then opera passion struck my brother. Actually, he's 1 year older than me. He's a tenor. He's still singing, and he's actually singing in the chorus right now in the arena.
Mm.
So he became very passionate. He started studying opera at home. So I started listening more and more to this music,
Mhm.
and suddenly something started, getting into my head, and I started enjoying more. I started finding out that opera wasn't this lesser genre of music that I expected it was. It was just as entertaining, just as interesting as symphonic music. And so I think the following summer I went to see a Rigoletto actually with Leonucci and Ingvar Muller. I think that was maybe 2001, 2002. And I fell in love with it. The day after, I felt the urge to go and buy my first opera record. And so I bought a Rigoletto. And then I went back and I saw Trovatore. I fell in love with that one as well. And I think that's how most people will start with opera. You know, you start with very little, and suddenly you get sucked into this world, and you cannot live anymore. And I never felt that I could start as a singer. To be fair, it was just a passion of going to the opera, you know, listening to these dramas, until my brother's singing teacher asked that he brought me to Milan with him, because he was just curious to listen to my voice. And it was a very weird request because he didn't know me. I didn't know the guy. One day my brother said, well, would you come with me to Milan? Because he'd be just curious to hear your voice. And I was like, why would I do that? There's nothing here. But eventually, you know, let's just go and have a day trip to Milan. It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
And for 10 minutes, he made me vocalize. And that was my switch. That was my spark. I felt like I had used for the first time a part of my body that I'd never exploited before fully. And the sensation, this vibration that you feel when you're singing with an operatic voice is so powerful. You know, the whole body is vibrating. And I felt like having superpowers. And in 10 minutes, I decided, wow, this is what I want to do, actually. I would love to start doing this. And
So
so this,
I'm going to stop you there because it's a fascinating topic that I want to go deeper on, but I want to give listeners a little more background about Verona. The festival, often that theater can hold up to 19,000 people. And the main level, they have folding chairs, but in the cheaper seats, these are stone steps that are almost 2,000 years old. And people sit on the stone steps and they bring cushions. And because Verona happens to be a major railway intersection between the north-south coming from Munich and Innsbruck and the Brenner Pass, going down to Bologna, then Florence and Rome, and then the lateral one, which is like highway number 4 in Italy, from Torino to Milan, to Novara, to Milan, to Brescia, to Verona, then Vicenza, then Padova, then Venice, and then Trieste. People can arrive in Verona from all these different directions very easily. And you have the nearby lake, which is a gorgeous setting for nature. You have the wine industry in Verona is remarkable. Also, the fruit industry, the cherries, the plums, the peaches, to a lesser degree, the pears. And so they make a lot of the jams or preserves in Italy come from the province of Verona, along with these amazing wines. So every year, usually March or April, there's something called Vinitaly, which is the largest wine fair in Italy. And with my wine cap on, I've been a speaker and a presenter at Vinitaly. But my first time in Verona was well before you were born. I was a student in Bologna when I was 19. I was studying at the DOMS, which is the performing arts school in Bologna. And I was working on theater and opera production, regia, messa in scena. And at that time, we students who were doing that, and we were only 3 of us, were being handed around to people like Pierluigi Pizzi, Luca Ronconi, Franco Zeffirelli, And Zeffirelli was working a lot in Verona. So he invited me to Verona in the summer to be one of his assistants. He had many, he had a staff,
Mm.
and we worked for free, but we learned from Franco Zeffirelli. And he did these productions in Verona. Now, what no one tells you about Verona, because the tourist board doesn't want you to know this, there's a lot of rain in Verona. It just happens to be a spot. I guess that's why the fruit trees and the grapes are so well nourished. There was a lot of rain in Verona. And if a performance begins and then it rains and is canceled, you don't get your money back. If if the rain begins before the performance, you get your money back. And because it's an opera festival, it has to make its money. What all the singers and all the producers do in Verona is they check the weather reports, because people come from long distances. And if they're staying a night in Verona, they're paying for a hotel, or they're staying at a campeggio, a campground nearby. They might be staying in Mantova or Cremona nearby, or in Valeggio sul Mincio to eat the tortellini, or Lake Garda. And I can remember many performances that the rain would start. And sometimes people would open their umbrellas, 19,000 umbrellas, waiting for the rain to stop. Because the other thing that was done in Verona when I was a kid and a young man was that people would bring candles. And when it got dark, they would suddenly light their candles. And you'd see 19,000 lights. Now, what they do is they take their mobile phones and they open the phone, so you don't have candles. And I was worried that a fire would start there, but it never did. But it's so incredibly atmospheric, because where the moon sets is over behind the stage, so that you could be sitting in the audience for paying not much money all the way up, watching Aida, and then the Nile scene with the moon over the Nile and the real moon over the theater. It's magic. And so I could argue that it's not always the best musically, although they get the greatest stars to sing there. But sometimes it's a little under rehearsed, or you have multiple casts, or as you said, Aida was only available for 2 acts, and so they bring in another. The stage might be wet. It's a very broad stage, so therefore the sound is such that it's not like, say, La Scala or Covent Garden or the Met, where the sound is concentrated from the stage. Here, it's completely broad, and the sound comes from different directions. But I'm not complaining, because it's absolutely wonderful. And then after, you go out to the Piazza Bra and the Bottega del Vino and other restaurants, and you have a meal at midnight or a pizza. So it's something everybody needs to do at least once. And what a lucky little boy you and your brother were to be able to be in that environment and to have it be part of your heritage. Because I don't think people realize, um, if you grew up in Milan, you may know La Scala. If you grew up in New York, you know the Met, but not everybody experiences it. But in Verona, where for an entire summer it's happening every night and 19,000 people are there, if you're in Verona, you can't help but experience it. And therefore, the relationship of people in Verona to opera is unlike any other city I know in the world. Yes, Bayreuth has the Festspiel House, and yes, Salzburg has the festival, and other places like that, but not 19,000 people a night.
Mm.
And so that every person I know who lives in Verona, whether, like my friend Ricardo, about whom I told you, was not in the arts at all, he's in finance, but he's aware, it's part of his culture and his heritage that this opera goes on there. And they mostly do Italian operas, not completely. They'll do Carmen on occasion, but it's mostly Italian operas. And for many people, it's the way they first get exposed to opera, wherever they're from in the world. And yes, it can be a little touristy, but it doesn't matter. It's a wonderful, unique setting for opera. And so I'm very happy for you that you got to grow up in that. I'm happy for me that I got there at the age of 19, so that it really became early part of my heritage as well, because there's really nothing like it in the whole world.
Yeah.
What did I leave out?
Yeah, I mean, it's all true. It's gradually changing. A lot of things are changing. Um, I actually worked there for 9 seasons.
Mm,
A lot of the Veronese, this festival provides so many workplaces over the summer, so it's the ideal student job. So
yeah.
as I started studying opera, I also got my first. I really wanted to work in there just to have the chance to see the shows.
Hmm.
And so I got a job in the front of house, and I became an usher, and then that was my sort of my first career. And so I got to see a lot of these shows, but a lot of people get jobs as extras. Even
Hmm.
people who have no interest in opera whatsoever, they will start working and be part of the show and get to know the music. So you work with the chorus, you work. It's a beautiful environment. It totally dominates your summers.
Yeah.
When you are in your university years, or even later in life, some people are still doing this job even in their maybe 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Did you ever appear in a production of Verona, or were you front of house from the beginning?
No, not yet. Well, only front of house. Yeah.
I mean, even as an extra, the reason I ask is because I want listeners to know that you and I are friends. We did not meet in Italy. I've never seen you in Italy. You
That's
live
true.
in London, and you were working front of house at the Royal Opera House.
I
And I
was.
was attending, or I was maybe working there teaching a symposium because I've taught a bit at the Royal Opera. And you cut a very good figure in the lobby. And I knew you were Italian without talking to you. I think I went up and just started speaking to you in Italian. And and then I discovered that your English is perfect British English. But we'll go back to Italy for a bit. But how did it wind up that you worked at the Royal Opera House in London in front of house? And did you bring your experience from Verona to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the time, I had spent 9 summers working in this summer opera festival and in the winter opera house as well. And I was working as
In
a front of
Verona.
house manager in Verona. Yeah, and I always dreamt of a work experience abroad.
Hmm.
And I can only speak English other than Italian and
So
Veronese.
that was the Teatro Filarmonico, it's called.
The Teatro Filarmonico, yeah.
And
There's another
that's not
season.
far from the Arena, but it's a real traditional Italian winter opera house that
Yeah.
or opera house indoors that's very tall compared to a lot of opera houses. The inside, the theater is quite tall.
It's a big hole. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was bombed during the Second World War, so it
Uh-huh.
was rebuilt in the 50s. In fact, on the outside you can see it has a little bit of fascist
Hmm.
style. But yeah, it's in the main square as well. Well, most people don't know the main entrance is actually right at the edge where the
Yeah.
say the gates to the main square are. And the entrance of the opera house is still original. And actually,
Hmm.
you have this Sala Maffeiana, this beautiful hall where they have chamber music concerts now.
Yeah.
But yeah, then there's the main opera house is just like any other or resembles, I mean, the Italian style opera house. And so yeah, I was dreaming of working abroad and living in a different country, and I got a job here at the Royal Opera House in the front of house as well. And I thought, well, that's even better opportunity to get to see some more opera and
Hmm.
keep being in touch with this world and learning a lot from all the performances that I was lucky enough to see in my life. I mean, if you have the opera passion, you soon realize that it's really expensive passion to have.
Yeah.
Traveling tickets. So to get a job in a beautiful opera house, one like this one in London, for example, or the one in Verona, just gives you uh, a lot of possibilities. And also, when I
So,
moved to London, I wasn't singing anymore at
right.
the time. I took a long break in my development because I felt like I wasn't getting what I what I wanted out of my training.
We're going to get back to your training and your return to singing, but I don't know the year you and I met, but the last time I was in London was the very last opera I attended before the pandemic. And it was March 7th or 6th of 2020 with Fidelio with
Oh,
Lisa Davidson and
oh
Jonas
yeah.
Kaufman. And I flew home to New York on March 8th, and I've never been back to Europe since because I have responsibilities here and I miss Europe, and I will eventually get back there and probably starting with Italy. But in my own life, my own working life in opera and other lives, basically I have a triangle of New York, London, and Italy, mostly northern Italy. And my work experience since 1975 has been that triangle. And so London has always been very, very much part of my life and my cultural life, my working life. And I'm not sure when you and I met, but I have a feeling that it's when the Royal Opera House was undergoing construction, redevelopment. They basically took this building that was an old building and turned it into a new building, but a lot of it is still the old building. Would you talk about the rather radical changes that have been experienced at the Royal Opera House as a building, as a facility?
Oh, well, the building you see now is a collage of, of different things.
Yeah.
Once there was the original opera house, the 1858 building, a Victorian opera house, which is the auditorium we still go to today. And that was an independent building that was separated by anything around. Next to it, they built in the same year this floor hall, this Victorian glass and iron structure that they used to rent out to the flower sellers of Covent Garden. And the
As
story
in My
how,
Fair Lady, as in Pygmalion
as
by
you see
Shaw.
in
Yeah.
My Fair Lady, exactly, you see how that was. That structure was right on the ground floor, adjacent to the auditorium, and there was nothing else. Now there's a huge building
Mhm.
is including the floor hall and the Royal Opera House auditorium, the main auditorium. Um, so the theater, how it's been since 1858, and that is actually the third building on the site as an opera house. The first one was 1732.
Right.
Then they built a larger opera house in 1808, and that one destroyed as well. And then 1858, they built another one slightly smaller.
And just to add a little bit, nearby is the Drury Lane Theater,
Yeah.
which dates back more or less to the time, I believe, of the 1732 theater.
Mm,
And it's a very large, long theater. The streets in London, they are very tight. It's not like Verona, Milan, New York, Vienna, where there's a
mm,
broad, or Paris, there's a broad space in front of the opera house you approach. Here it's tucked into very old London. And the streets, Bow Street and Floral Street, are really
mm.
very narrow. And the
Uh,
accessibility is entirely different. And the way one approaches the building could not be more different from most of the famous opera houses in the world. And yet it has its own very special character.
that's true. And in fact, they had to update the backstage. I think they had the huge need of bringing together all the workshops, all the sets, and the ballet company as well, because you
Mhm.
have that is the venue of the Royal Opera and the Royal Ballet, and the Royal Ballet at the time was rehearsing and training somewhere else, and so they built this huge all corner that is now the corner of the Covent Garden Piazza on one side,
Mhm.
um, to have all of these facilities in place, and so to update. Sorry, um, to update the possibilities of the opera house, and so now they can perform, three different productions at the same time, rotating ballet, opera. It's a whole different theater with very different possibilities. So this happened in 1997. They closed the theater down for 2 years until 1999, and they made some substantial changes without changing what we know as the auditorium. The main auditorium, the floor hall next to it was taken down, lifted up one floor, and actually halved. When you get into this structure, which is now one of the bars and the restaurants of the Opera House, you have this giant mirror at the end of the hall that just gives you the sort of a feeling of how big it used to be before it was reduced in size to make space for the enlargement of the backstage of the main auditorium. And so now you have all these structures that were there since 1999 until 2000, probably 2017, 2018, when they decided to renovate part of the new side of the building to update the bar areas, the Limbury Theatre, which is another auditorium, which is built underground in there. So yeah, they
I
managed to do
did.
this second renovation.
I'm trying to think, when did you start there? Because I'm trying to figure out when I met you.
It was 2013.
Okay, that's when I met you, because in 2013, I actually had a job at the Royal Opera House. I've had jobs before and since, but I remember that one because the Lindbury Theater was pretty new, and I was teaching and doing master classes in the Lindbury, and was
Oh wow.
invited by the education department. And at that time, I forget his name, but the man who was the head of opera at the Royal Opera House was also at the BBC. And BBC has Radio 3, which is music, and Radio 4, which is culture and arts. And I did a program that was at the Lindbury, but recorded by BBC and played on Radio 3 and Radio 4, about the relationship of the Royal Opera House to the neighborhood, but specifically about food, and about how different singers and restaurateurs who lived in the area would take apartments, for example, at the Strand Hotel or the Savoy or other places nearby, and insist on having kitchens, and how the restaurants and the hotels nearby created the cuisine that entered the Royal Opera House. And then I had singers singing music relating to the food. It was terrific. And I had a wonderful time. It was called opera or opera buffet, as opposed to opera buffa. It was opera buffet, and it was people can still find it on BBC if they go online. But so that would be when I met you, because I was there for several months. The first time I went to the Royal Opera would have been 1975, on one of my trips from Bologna to London. At that time, there were student charters, and you would land at Luton Airport. And I stayed at a B&B at 29 Gower Street. And I remember walking to the Royal Opera House, and they had for £1.20 student seats. And they were in something called the slips. And I didn't know what the slips were. Would you describe what the slips are and how they might be good for opera, but they're not good for ballet?
Yeah, I mean the slits are this lateral rows of seats that you find in the opera house right at the top. They might have seats or they might have standing places. And so you get that because of the acoustic of the hall, you get a really good sound experience. You have a really good acoustic experience. Some of these seats, the one near to the stage, are actually sold as listening seats because
Yeah.
you really can't see much. So yeah, if you're into opera and you're particularly into some singers, you are on a budget and you don't mind not experiencing the whole of the production from a visual point of view, then you might go for the slips. And actually, the regulars are usually fighting for these seats because they're very cheap, but you get a very good listening experience. Of course, if you are going for the ballet, what you're most interested in is watching the ballet dancers performing. So you might want to get a seat that has a better view.
Well, I
But
didn't
yeah,
know that initially. So I remember the people like Anthony Dowell and Merle Park were performing, and I know that I was in the space with them, but I didn't really see them. But I equate London not only with opera and with theater going, which is what I mainly did when I went there, but I didn't see much ballet in New York before because I was young when I left for Europe. Then I got to working in opera, and in Italy there was not that much ballet. But in London, I went to the Royal Ballet religiously. And so my context for ballet, there was Alicia Markova, there was, I can't remember her name, the Cuban dancer, the wonderful Cuban dancer who
oh,
became
well,
blind to dance Giselle even when she was blind. She founded the National Ballet of Cuba. I will think of her in a moment. But she was
oh,
a
the
still
male dancer or female dancer?
female, female.
Oh no,
She was a friend of Fidel Castro. Yeah. Anyway, we'll think of her. But I later, in later years, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, she came and danced as a very old woman at the Met and was extraordinary with ABT. Alicia Alonso was her name. And, but I realized that I heard singers at the Royal Opera in the 70s that were not singing in Italy and that I had never heard in New York, or if they came to New York or Italy, not much, or I couldn't get a ticket. So, for example, I remember it was New Year's Eve, I believe 1975 to 1976. There was a gala, and I was in the slip, and it was probably £3 for the special concert. And the weather was terrible. And the manager came out and he announced that we have a guest who's arrived from the continent, from Europe, and there was no tunnel at that time. So she got on a ferry in France or Belgium and sailed across the Atlantic, and they picked her up in the south of England and drove her to the opera house.
wow.
And because she did not want to disappoint her loyal fans in London, ladies and gentlemen, Birgit Nilsson. And Birgit Nilsson got through all of that weather, and she came to the Royal Opera House, and it was rather normal at that time because, yes, Birgit Nilsson sang a lot at the Met, but when she lived in Europe, and these great stars who lived in Europe, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Walter Berry and Tito Gobi, all these people would come to the Royal Opera House because it wasn't that far. And they would either fly or take the ferry because there was no tunnel at the time. And it was just amazing the people we heard there. Now, the productions, as someone who was trained in Italy and America, were not special because the stage was very small. And so Covent Garden was like the old Metropolitan Opera House that did not have much of a stage. It was a singer's house. And the audiences that I know in London are very knowledgeable and opinionated and passionate about singing. And this applies to people who work in the art form, but people who just love opera. And they had their very strong ideas because I, for a period, I have beloved friends who were one of the possessors of what's called the Bedford box. And the Bedford box has a private elevator and a toilet that dates back to about 1870, and a little kitchen and a dining room and a wine cellar and so on. And it's a lovely thing. You don't see much of the stage. But when you sit in the Bedford box, what you get to see is Antonio Pappano or some other conductor and the orchestra really working. So that Fidelio that I went to in March of 2020, I could see Lisa Davidson, I could see Jonas Kaufman when they were downstage, but any other action or production I didn't really see, and that was okay. So my associations with the theater, whether it's the Slip or the Bedford box or other places, is often not about what I see, but what I hear. And it's very particular for that. And I'd love to know what you think about hearing opera at the Royal Opera House as opposed to seeing it, because you love opera, of course. But to me, it's a very different experience from the other major opera houses of the world. And Covent Garden is certainly one of the top 5 or 6 in the world.
Well, I've always loved the auditorium. I still love going there, even though I don't work at the opera house anymore. But still one of my favorite opera houses to go to. And yeah, the box you went to, the Bedford box, is quite a special box because it's still the only privately owned box in the Opera House. And the
Mhm.
one right next to it, which is called the Royal Box,
Yep.
is the place that Queen Victoria had, chosen for herself. And
Would
it
you
has
tell the
just a
story, or if you don't, then I will, about Queen Victoria's box in the mirror?
Yeah, so she really didn't care about the restricted view. The Royal Box has just a restricted view as the Bedford was. You can't see much of the action unless you're
Mhm.
really leaning forward. And she didn't even care to sit in the side of the box that had the best view. She would just sit on the opposite side and look, rather than looking onto the stage, she would just look onto the auditorium to be seen by the majority
At her
of the
subjects.
faithful. And she would
Yeah.
have this mirror hanging on the other um, wall of the box so that she could get some of the action on stage through the refraction. So it wasn't about, going to the opera in centuries. Hasn't been much about seeing the show or
Yep.
listening to the performance. It was about being seen. And so it was at the time in 1858. Now it's a different story, and so people are happy to pay even just to listen to whatever's going on, even if they don't get to see anything on stage.
Another observation I'll make, and I hope this doesn't offend people, but I'll say it anyway. This audience at the Royal Opera drinks a lot more than the audiences do in most theaters I know. And when I say
They
drink, I
sorry.
mean they drink a lot more alcohol.
Oh, they drink and eat. I will say when I
They
moved
eat
here, I
a
found
lot. I
out
mean,
about
the
this.
eating is great. There are other theaters where you eat well. I would name Munich, Stockholm, Madrid as three of the greatest eating places in opera. The one in Rio de Janeiro is very good. The one in Amsterdam is very democratic in that you have prices are low and you have things like Dutch soup and sandwiches and chocolates and coffees, and everyone can eat, and the prices are the same. But in Munich, for example, they have delicate, delicious things like crab, uh, sour cherry juice, things very carefully selected. Stockholm has three great restaurants. One of them is one of the grandest restaurants in Europe. Another one is Bakficken, which is where a lot of the stagehands and the chorus members go, and it's traditional meatballs and herring and Swedish beer. And then there's a cafe. Madrid has an elegant restaurant, but the one in London, there's very good food, but there is a lot of wine. And I don't know, in my experience, when I go to the opera, I don't drink alcohol at all because I really want to be focused. I'm usually jet lagged. And I really want to be focused. But, and I say this with all love, my British friends order their drinks ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean
And they know what they're going to have in the interval, the intermission, and they order that ahead of time.
so you don't
And
have to queue to buy your glass of wine and
exactly,
and waste those precious minutes.
exactly.
Um, that they call the Flora Hall is called actually the Champagne Bar. There's
Yeah,
actually three restaurants and three bars inside the Royal Opera House. So there's a huge relationship between, music, live shows, and food and drinks in this country, and people love to have the night out, the night at the opera as a combination of the two. So they will pre-arrange the meals so that they fit exactly into the pre-opera, the interval, the second interval, and so they can have a full dinner through the show. Also because things tend to close down very early here in London, so the opera ends in time for everyone to be able to take their train back home. Which is something, maybe in Spain or in Italy is not as important. The opera
right.
finishes tends to finish very late. In Verona, opera can finish after 1 a.m.
It
and you
doesn't.
still will be able to leave the auditorium and you will find that all of the restaurants in the main square are waiting 20 minutes after the end of the show to
Yeah.
accommodate all the people that are
Pizza
coming
or
out of the opera.
risotto in Verona. It's pizza
Yeah, you
risotto
would eat
after the opera.
afterwards because you don't
Yeah,
want to be sleepy while you're watching the
exactly.
show. And also the connection between ice cream and opera, or ice cream and live shows. You know, there's not a theater in London that doesn't sell ice creams at the
And it's
interval.
very good. There's always someone who has a sort of a like a basket in front of them. And now some of them have an American brand called Haagen-Dazs, which is okay in America, but I don't travel to England to have
To eat
American
that.
style ice cream.
Yeah.
But there's wonderful ginger ice cream in London. It's really very good. And you get a container with a stick in it. You open it. It's beautifully designed. And you can eat inside theaters, which is something you cannot do in the United States for the most part.
Mm.
So that, when I go to regular theater, legitimate theater in London, I always feel I have to step outside to eat my ice cream, but I really don't. And I remember, especially the Arts Theater, which is near Piccadilly, that you could pre-order tea and you could sit in the theater with your teacup and not a paper cup, but a real teacup and saucer and drink your tea during the play, which was highly civilized. And that's part of what I dealt with in this presentation I did in 2013, Opera Buffet, about how really food is integrated for audience members into the experience of attending opera, ballet, and theater. Was as given that you worked in house management, was it a mess after to clean all that up, or did people throw out their ice cream cups, their glasses, and so forth?
Um, well, my team, we were only looking after the ice cream part of it. The ice cream is considered, a front of house job. And now, we used to have bins. It wasn't messy. It wasn't messy, but I realized that it was a big tradition. It's like deeply rooted in the
Yeah,
customs of Britain. So
right.
it was very weird for me. I will never, in Italy, it's true. You might find in Europe that there's wonderful restaurants in the opera houses, but most people just have an aperitif. Put them might have a little glass of wine and a few, nibbles, but nothing major. Even in Munich, although they have a restaurant, most people are not having a seated dinner. They will wait until the end of
True.
the opera and go to restaurants outside.
Um,
Whereas here,
is it
they
in
love
London
eating.
where the Crush Bar is?
Yeah,
The
so in
Crush
the old
Bar?
auditorium, the
Yeah,
still what used to be the bar of the original opera house,
right.
which is now called the Crush Room. It was the Crush Bar where they used to
Mhm.
serve this crushed ice and lemon orange juice.
That's right.
So they used to have a form of ice cream
Yeah.
back at the time as well. So it's a very old tradition.
I know because I researched it that this tradition of dining while attending performances goes back to the 18th century in London to Georg Friedrich Handel, who lived in London at 34 Brook Street in Mayfair and was a big eater. And this is a true story. When he would go to a restaurant, he'd sit down alone and order for three, and they'd say to him, "Are you waiting for your guest to arrive?" There are no guests, and he would eat basically three meals at once. Um, but they were serving all kinds of food at the theater on Royal Theater on Haymarket, in the forerunners to the Covent Garden, and then Covent Garden, the Royal Opera House, and it's a remarkable thing. But it's strange how these very old, beautiful theaters incorporate the dining experience and the drinking experience like nowhere else I know in the world. Really not.
I
Only
guess, I
Amsterdam with
guess
a modern theater has sort of an outdoor restaurant, but that's it.
I guess for the Italian audience, the interval is not long enough to exchange all the opinions they have about the show going on. So they have to wait until the post opera and then go for dinner so they can spend a couple of hours talking about what's going on stage.
Although there is a great thing at La Scala. It's a bar called Marquesino, and it's just outside the opera house. And there, I'm speaking 3 or 4 years ago, for €9, it would be more now, you could get a ciotola, a bowl of risotto alla Milanese. And that was the perfect thing to eat before because it was just enough that you weren't starving, but not so much that you get tired. And people would have a glass of red wine with that. I would not because I don't drink at the opera. But that was always such an elegant solution to the hunger. And they would have this huge wagon that would roll out at Marquesino a half hour before the opening. You'd pay your €9, and you would take your ciotola, and they'd fill it, and you would eat it and leave the bowl, and then you go in the theater. But nothing is like London, nothing in that regard. So now I want to ask you, I know that you took a break from being a singer, but now you have returned to singing lessons and performances. And unlike your brother who's a tenor, you're a baritone. And how did you start again your singing career? Why, but how? And now you're singing roles like Nabucco and Macbeth and Scarpia. In other words, the classic Italian baritone roles.
Well, I got at the point where, around 2010, where I felt like I wasn't getting what I needed, for the way that that my brain is processing information. I need a very clear, very science-based knowledge about how the voice works, how the support works, how all these muscles are to be coordinated to produce a kind of sound that is considered to be operatic, correct sound. And really, I couldn't find someone in Italy who would explain it to me. And I studied science on the other half of my life. So I studied natural science. I was into biology. I was into anatomy, and I wanted to get that picture of the human anatomy and the human voice. And so when I moved to London, I thought, well, maybe I should forget about the singing career. Maybe I can join my interest in science and opera and combine them to become a therapist for opera singers. And so I started looking into this kind of career, and that's how what I did. And so I became a therapist, a laryngeal manipulation therapist. So I do what they would call voice massage or laryngeal manipulation, um, just to learn the anatomical and side of things. Always having at the back of my mind this this idea that as soon as I could, I would have started taking lessons again. And I was lucky enough to, while working at the Opera House, to be surrounded by colleagues who were all opera students or had a passion for opera, that were singing in the conservatories here in London. So I would always investigate with all of them who they were singing with, what their lessons were like, what the technique was like, what the teachers were approach was like. And I found this colleague of mine, who was studying at the Royal Academy, and she told me about this teacher, and she was describing as her lessons. And the moment I heard what this guy was doing, this guy approach was like, I thought, wow, this is my guy. And so I took his email down, and I thought, as soon as I can afford to resume, training, I will definitely contact this person. And so a few years later, when I could afford to start taking lessons again, I went straight to him and I said, you know, I'm an Italian guy. I live in London. I used to study opera. I would like to start again, and I would like you to take me as a fresh private student. And so I went to the first lesson, and that was another another big spark for me. We had a really strong connection. The fact that I had the knowledge of anatomy meant for him that he could just refer to specific muscles or um, anatomical terms, and I will, pick on this information, on this tips, which is very different way from the Italian school where you are taught through images and feelings and sensations, which are very individual. There's no common scientific base for those. And so I just loved his approach, and mm, I got stuck with him basically for the last 7 years. And now and he was the one who told me, like, I think you shouldn't take this as a hobby. I think you should take it more
Mhm.
seriously and invest on this career. And so
Um,
that's what I did.
is this Raymond Cannell or is that someone else?
Yeah, it's Raymond Connell. Yeah, Australian
Okay,
guy.
right. I know who he is. And the reason I know him is because um one of the many things I'm interested in about you is the specific physical connection, the soft tissue therapy, this laryngeal manipulation that you described, because I've worked a lot in Finland at the opera companies
Oh
there,
yeah.
Sibelius Academy, the opera company
Mm.
in Helsinki, but also at the Savonlinna Festival. And in Savonlinna, a woman I went to did what was claimed to be the first vocal massage in the world, and that she had developed the techniques. I don't remember her long
Mm.
Finnish name, but I think the first name was Anna. Um, Savonlinna is famous also because the market has the most gorgeous strawberries you'll find anywhere. And they're wonderful in Wimbledon and London, but really the best strawberries I've had anywhere are in Savonlinna at the very brief season. And I remember bringing strawberries to the vocal massage therapist, and I enjoy massage of all types, but this was a very different experience because what she was working on, and maybe you could describe the technique more, is I'll let you pick the words, but I would say the freeing up of the area from the jaw, from the mandible through the throat into the chest and perhaps even lower, the diaphragm. And I'm not a singer, but I do a lot of public speaking and I like to speak without microphones. And therefore, I use a singer's training to project without straining my throat. Talk, please, in any way you want to, about the anatomy of producing good sound in a healthy way.
Well, just like any other movement in the body, speaking is performing a movement. There's different muscles or different fascial layers, so that are meant to be sliding inside the body and changing in their position. So the easier it is for them to perform the movement and to glide against one another. So the more you can reduce the internal friction of these movements, if you wish, and the more you can increase the perception of your own movement through freeing up the fascia, the higher quality the movement would be. So the better coordination you can develop, and the easier movement you can achieve. So just like any other athlete, singers are asked to perform a certain movement, and the quality of their singing depends hugely on the how refined their coordination is, how refined their control over these tiny little movements that they're performing is, rather than just power. So it's not a matter of how strong your support is or your pelvic floor is, but uh, how precisely can you connect to your support muscles, and how finely can you control them in their action of pushing the air out through the vocal folds.
So,
So I don't work just on the larynx. It's a matter of you,
right.
you could work on someone's legs to improve their connection with the floor and the perception of their balance, how to
Mhm.
distribute the weight in the body. So you have to have sort of a holistic approach to the voice as well.
People who watch this show for nearly 5 years know that I've done almost 250 shows now, that I've never worn a T-shirt before for my guest, but I just had a feeling that you and I were going to have a workout in one form or another between New York and London. And I want to, and I mean this very seriously, I want to promote this year more than ever the concept of music and health. It's something I've dealt with in various guests in the past on this program and elsewhere. And I'm deep in reading a book edited by Renee Fleming called Music and Mind, which is about the connection of the brain, but also the body to music and to opera, whether it's the memory of words, whether it's the memory of sound, whether it's the physical well-being, whether I know you study guitar. I interviewed someone a while ago who goes around a hospital in Maryland in the United States playing his guitar to relieve pain in people who deal with inflammation and cancer pain and so
Mm.
on. And so it's something I do care about very deeply. And Maestro Vincenzi, I'm here for my workout. um, but let's start with something. You're talking about a lot of anatomy, and I imagine that I know some singers who will have some sense of their anatomies. But let's start with the very basic thing, which is breathing. Does one breathe in through the nose, through the mouth? How does that work to produce proper opera singer sound?
Oh, well, there's different opinions about this. What I can tell you is that I always advise my clients and my colleagues to prepare their body for singing. I always do. I actually over the years I've developed my own routine. How do I prepare my body for singing? It's like, you know, you are an athlete and you have to run 100 meters and you want to be ready for that kind of movement. So how do I prepare my breath? How do I make sure that whatever breathing I coordination I have throughout my day when I'm not thinking about it, and then I have to prepare for another kind of another type of breathing coordination, and how do I make sure that that movement is as free as possible, so that all the muscles that should be engaging for that to be ideal to support my singing are going to be awakened and warmed up. What you are doing is you're releasing your fascia in these muscles. So, you know, I used to spend, sometimes it was kind of ridiculous. I got to a point where I don't do that anymore, but where I used to spend more time stretching and breathing and doing exercises than actual singing practice.
Mhm.
And whenever something wasn't working vocally for me, I always had this feeling that it was that physical anatomical element that could have
Mhm.
been improved to get it right. So this has been an essential part of my vocal development. I think it's essential for anyone to make the movement just slightly easier before you start singing, so that maybe there is that one extra chance that you get it right, and then that gets into your neurology and becomes a habit, and then you can rediscover it the day after and after and build on top of it. And I still do. I mean, if I have the more important the singing practice is, or the audition, or the lesson, whatever I have coming up, the more I will spend on my body stretching. Uh, yeah, I mean, when I sing, I breathe through the mouth, of course.
Mhm.
But I truly believe in the power of nasal breathing. I would definitely make sure that you engage the diaphragm just a little bit more when you're breathing through the nose. So if you are looking to release your diaphragm, if you are in a stage where maybe you wanting to release your diaphragm a little bit more and free it up a little bit more, whatever you're doing is probably going to be combined with nasal breathing.
I had the privilege on a couple of occasions of participating in master classes given by the great Crystal Ludwig, the mezzo soprano, was one of the
Uh,
greatest singers and actress and opera personality. She had everything. but she was uncompromising in her approach, and she could be a loving teacher, but she could also be very critical if she felt something was amiss. And the thing that she most focused on was young singers was breathing. And you'd have a nervous young man come out and say, "I'm a tenor, and I'm going to sing from Verdi's Rigoletto, Ella mi fu rapita," and he would sort of crack up, and she'd stop him and say, "You're not breathing." "Yes, I'm. No, you're not breathing." And she would get into his head that he really was not breathing. And if he didn't seem to understand, she'd say, "Do you have a cat?" "Yes." "Or do you have a dog?" "Yes." "Get down on the floor now." And when young singers are doing their master classes with the great Crystal Ludwig, they wear the best clothing they could find. And I remember feeling so terrible for these people who had to get down on the dusty floor at the stage of Juilliard or Carnegie Hall and just stretch out on the floor as if they were a cat.
Mm.
Because she would always say, "Your cat does not think about how it breathes. It just breathes. And you have to breathe like your cat. You have to breathe like your dog." They never think about it. They just do it. It's the most natural part of their living. And they get their air and they get their oxygen breathing that way. And
Mm.
until you can breathe like your cat, I don't want to hear you. Poor petrified singers. And they would try everything they could. And then you'd say, "Okay, now stand up and now sing from Rigoletto. And let me food up pizza." And suddenly he would find that he had more air.
Mm.
And it was just a remarkable thing. And she used animal imagery rather than biology because
Mm.
maybe she didn't think that. Maybe she thought, I want to breathe in the most natural way, the way an animal does. But I find that every talented singer and musician, because sometimes if you're a violinist, you have to breathe in a certain way, pianist, of course, conductor. Um, so therefore, there are different ways of getting to this nirvana of breathing. But another question I want to ask, because I've discussed this with singers and with singing teachers, and we have adult listeners to this program, but we're not we're not going to go pornographic. Um, I know a very talented, wonderful mezzo soprano, now retired from singing, had a very long career, who teaches women how to sing because of her belief that the structure of the anatomy lower down of a woman is different from a man. As the singer says to me and everyone, "I never had those parts. So I don't know how to sing from those parts because I've never had a man's parts. I have a woman's genital parts, and I can teach that to women." You're a man. In your experience in working with people, are there anatomical differences in terms of how you were talking about the pelvic floor, about how sound can be produced if you're starting down there as a man or a woman?
Mm.
Or is it the same? Is it the same muscles?
Well, yeah, definitely the ideal coordination of a breath support will start from your pelvic floor. Whether you're a man or a woman, yeah, it's different anatomically, but we all have pelvic floor muscles. And so
Okay.
it's the duty of every singer to, spend time releasing the pelvic floor and reconnecting if they've lost connection to the pelvic floor so that they can feel when this is engaging and learn how to control those muscles that are not muscles that we're generally used to feel or engage and you know um, it is essential. I believe that in the correct out breath coordination, one of the first things that you would engage, if not the first thing that you engage, is your pelvic floor. If the sequence of contraction is wrong, let's say I'm engaging more of my upper abdominals, which are tightly connected to my diaphragm. What I'm doing is actually locking the breath flow, and therefore the flow of air is reduced, and I will put too much pressure on my vocal folds. If I can develop that correct coordination where my lower abdominals, my pelvic floor are engaging, then I can control my breath flow a lot better and improve my vocal technique, I think.
Now, would a vocal technique be identical or similar if you're singing Handel or Mozart or Rossini or Wagner or Verdi or Benjamin Britten or someone else? Does the style of music and the way it appears on the page and how many 16th notes there are in Rossini, for example, does it dictate the way one establishes, manages one's physical technique?
Well, today I will answer that is the same coordination. I think the challenges of keeping the breath flow consistent, and are different. But the principles behind it are the same. So if you can create a legato phrase in a bel canto repertoire, then and you should be able to do the same in and translate that onto a Verdian repertoire or Verismo, for me, the challenges are different. The quantity of notes is different. The consonants are different. The amount of articulation is different. But the same would be between singing Italian or German or French. The principles are the same, but the challenge of applying the principles might change. I guess if I can, resolve an issue I always go back to the basics and check that my breath support, my airflow is not reduced, is not that I'm not locking onto, that I'm not adding tension to any other parts of my body that are not supposed to help in the process.
Would a singer, I'm going to say he, but of course it could be she, would he focus when singing in performance as opposed to rehearsal actively on all the biology that you're addressing, or by then should it be second nature and no longer thought about even, but that something else should be thought about in performance?
Well, I think um, the aim is to make this coordination second nature and actually connect this coordination to your emotion. So,
Mhm.
or at least this is the way I'm taught and the way that I believe in. It's your emotion that
Mhm.
is creating the right coordination once that's been trained and
Yeah.
it's ingrained in your brain. Um, what normally happens is that probably on stage you have different presentations of situations where you might notice that you're going maybe down a wrong route of tension, and therefore maybe you want to remind yourself that you need to take a good release breath, that you need to bring your larynx back down, that you need to relax some areas of your body that are tensing up too much because you're not, I don't know, something is going in a different way. But probably that is a small percentage. I think you cannot drive that program through um, your prefrontal cortex. You have to make it second nature and then drive the automatic program through your emotions. So deliver the emotion and your body will give you the right coordination if you practice enough.
In November, I think, I also teach in the Italian department of New York University. I have something called Adventures in Italian Opera. And somehow I had a lot of bass baritones this fall. I had Christian Van Horn, I had Ryan Sweeto Green, and I had Patrick Carfizzi. And Patrick Carfizzi is a very fine singer, much loved here in New York. And I believe we were talking about the character Antonio in Le Nozze di Figaro, which is a role that you've played. And Antonio has had a lot to drink, not as much as some of the patrons at the Royal Opera House, but he's had a lot to drink. And so therefore his character is different because he's drunken and he's seeing things that he believes, like Cherubino jumping out of a window or landing in plants, but no one believes him because he's drunk. And therefore the physicalization and the characterization of someone like Antonio is different, say, from Scarpia or Nabucco, where it's about solid acting and delivery of the music and the line and so on, and interacting. Does a role like Antonio, which is very physical but very comedic, and not I won't say that. I was going to say not requiring the same technique. It requires technique, but the technique gets masked in a way that other rather classical roles for baritone or any role, any voice, would not face. How do you teach someone the best vocal technique if they're on the ground drunk, as opposed to standing and singing in that way?
Um, well, my instinctive answer to this would be remember that we are performing the tiniest percentage of operas that are the most selected masterpieces in
Mm-hmm.
history. So who wrote them had something really, really, really special that
Yeah.
that allowed them to survive to centuries of performances and selection.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously when you're dealing with this is like when you're it's in the music, I would say.
Yeah.
The music is definitely something that's uncommon. It's very
Mm-hmm.
rare. It's genius,
Yeah.
and it's in there. So it's in the music of Antonio. He sounds like if you do what's written on the score,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't sound very. It sounds a little bit intoxicated by itself.
Yeah.
If you follow the score of Scarpia, Puccini brings you to the result he was looking for, delivering the kind of personality that he was hoping to put on stage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the basics is still the same. I mean, the moment you can you just can perform what's written, then you're going to get the results that
Mm-hmm.
the composer wanted.
I read recently that London would be the seventh or eighth largest Italian city in the world,
Ah,
after
possible.
7 or 8 cities in Italy, and that places like Verona, there are actually more Italians in London than in Verona. Verona has about
I wouldn't be
250,000 people, if I
surprised.
recall, and Bologna has 5 or 600,000. Florence 450. So those cities um, might have a bigger population of Italians than London. Obviously, Milan, Rome, Torino, Napoli, Genova have bigger populations. But you're a Londoner. I've known you, as I said, primarily through your London life. And given that Brexit has changed the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union and the countries of the European Union, um, but yet hundreds of thousands of Italians still live in London, contribute to the city's arts and culture and cuisine and clothing and every public life, medicine, I'm sure, and law and every. I have an Italian British friend who is a barrister in London, and his family is from Liguria, but he's 100% British. He loves Italy, but he really feels British. The question I have is, and I have many other Italian friends who live in London and the UK. At a certain point, do you feel more British? Do you feel like an Italian living in London? What do you feel? If you feel anything, you may not. You may just be very matter of fact about it.
Well, I have a British passport as well now,
Okay.
but I'm left feeling like I'm neither Italian, neither British at this point. You know, when I go back to Verona, they say, "Oh, you sound British." When I come here, they say, "You sound Italian." Um, you have attachments in both places, so you don't get to feel. I don't get to feel at home in Verona anymore, which is very, I guess, very unusual for a Veronese. We tend to be
Yeah.
quite attached to our city. And I myself never thought I would have moved away from it. I love London. Every time I come back here, I feel at home. And so it's a weird feeling. You
Yeah.
you don't have a place, or you have two places.
You have two places, and there are different aspects. I'm speaking for myself now of my personality and character that are awakened in Italy than here in New York. But as I said, London is my third place, and I'm twice a foreigner in London because my Italian side, you experience that kind of thing, but my American side, the British have very conflicting feelings about Americans. I've had London taxi drivers say things to me like, "Well, you're very intelligent for an American," which is, I've heard this more than once, and I'm not saying I'm intelligent, I'm saying I'm an American. And somehow the expectations of us culturally are different. Either we're supposed to, love rock and roll, which I do, or know nothing about food. I know a lot about food, or in some ways speak like the stereotypes of my country.
Mm.
And I'm not that. Um, and in Italy, when I'm there, people always say to me, "Well, you feel very Italian, but just not from my town," whatever the town is. So um, it's all okay. But I ask you because you are one of those people, I'm another, and I know many, who have one foot in at least two different places. And our cultural and socialization speak of both of those places and not simply, I'm not in exile in Italy or in London when I'm there. I'm not an American exile. But on the other hand, when I'm here in New York, I notice what I'm missing in terms of Italian life, but also British life. And your English is so good. You may say people say to you that, you're an Italian in London, but you really have incorporated life in London. Is there anything from Italy you miss? The food?
No, actually,
Not even the
I
food?
found the food. I love to cook, so the
Okay.
one thing that I cannot cook is Neapolitan pizza, and I have to
No,
say the pizza in London is better than pizza in Verona. Don't tell
really?
anyone.
Wow.
There's a lot of really good pizza here. So I found some really good ice cream. I've got my bakeries. I've got some good restaurants. No, I don't miss the food, and I can always go back. London is so easy to travel to Europe.
Yeah.
If you want to go anywhere, you can go anywhere. In 90 minutes, I can be in Verona. It's
It's
a
not
90
like
minute
Birgit
flight.
Nielsen in the past getting on a ferry and
Yeah,
going through the English Channel.
yeah, we can get
True.
singers here much more easily now.
Yeah, it's true. So, Emil Vincenzi, did I leave anything out in our conversation that you would have brought up?
Well, I think we covered a lot.
I think we did too.
I think we
But
covered a lot.
I thank you for this visit. I recommend your work as it's not a massage therapist. It is a soft tissue therapist.
It wouldn't feel like a massage, I think, to most people. It can be very intense, uh,
Okay.
and it can be very emotional too.
Okay.
We didn't speak about the emotional side of
Please do.
soft tissue
Please do.
therapy.
Please
Well,
do. I would love to know about that.
a lot of what relates to the voice, relates to our identity, to how we try to be perceived by others, and so often is shaped in our growing up.
Yeah.
It's shaped by the events and by the the traumas that we suffer in life. So touching someone's larynx or neck, jaw, tongue can result in big emotional releases because it's deeply connected to our emotions and our identity as a person. So yeah, I wouldn't, some people call it voice massage. Some people perform it as a massage, and it's a much lighter
Yeah.
form. Uh, I go with the fascia therapy approach, which can be a lot more intense, but I find also a lot more effective.
Well, I think intensity is a wonderful thing. I have many people disagree with me all the time on that.
It
And when
definitely is an opera.
they don't quite know what to say, they say, you're a nice guy, but you're so intense. And I think intense is a great thing. So because it means we are living our feelings and our emotions and what we care about, whether it's politics, whether it's whatever it is. It doesn't mean we have to be obnoxious. So if my politics are different from someone else's, it doesn't mean that you become obnoxious. But people really care about things, are the interesting people to me.
That is
And
true.
intensity, all right, this is my byword for 2025. Good health, happiness, taking care of other people, but also living intensely, I think is a very important thing. We only get one shot at life, I believe, so that live it with intensity.
Deliver intense emotions
Yeah,
on stage and off
yeah.
stage.
For those of you who do that, and for those of us who don't deliver, I mean, I'm on other stages, but nonetheless, I know what you're saying. It's about a kind of honesty that a lot of people put up barriers against to not
Mm.
be dishonest, but to prevent the full intensity of the honest emotions that come forth. So, wow. Thank
Has
you,
been
Doc.
intense. Has been more intense.
Ooh, I feel better. But really, Emil Vincenzi, thank you so much. It
Thank
has been
you. Thank you
wonderful
for
to
the chat.
converse with you, and I'm sure you're findable in London for people who would seek your work and also want to hear you sing, as I would recommend. Um, but you're doing the operatic gods work.
I hope so. We try.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred.